Hey guys, Will Contain here doing a quick retrospective review of the photobook Someday Chicago by Yasuhiro Ishimoto. So I meant to do this for Asian American History Month, but time got away from me and I wasn't able to do that. Some of the main themes I think people will want to discuss when it comes to that context are being an eternal foreigner or feeling like an eternal foreigner, not feeling entirely Asian nor feeling entirely American. So that's why I want to discuss Ishimoto today, because I feel like he's really important to that conversation. I first learned about Ishimoto during a lecture at DePaul University, and this book is actually a special edition for that lecture series, so shout out to them. Before I'm able to get into the pictures in the book, I do want to, or feel the need to give some background on Ishimoto's life and who he is. In 1921, Ishimoto is born in San Francisco, California, but his parents moved back to Japan when he's about 3 years old, and he spends his entire education there, finishes high school, and then moves back to the United States in 1939, only 3 short years before the attack on Pearl Harbor and the following internment of Americans of Japanese descent. Ishimoto is sent to a camp named Amache in Colorado, where he's interned. Cameras are actually widely confiscated as a part of narrative control, one could imagine, but those rules are relaxed in May of 1943, and this is where he begins learning photography with a 35mm Kodak camera from some of the other detainees. I'll try to put some pictures on here. They show some from inside the camp when he was learning. So, in 1945, the US government releases Ishimoto but sends him to live in Chicago as part of a larger effort to scatter the Americans of Japanese descent across the country and diminish their cultural ties, and I suppose in their minds to integrate them into larger American society. It's at this time, which coincides with a migration of Black Americans to the industrializing Midwest and Northeast. In his work, you can obviously see the experience that he's gained from the camps and his thoughts or questions about race, youth, and innocence come across in all these photos that we're going to take a look at shortly. So his most frequented locations in Chicago were downtown streets, parks, and beaches. And these are places where you see a lot of mixing of social classes and races, but they're also cultural flashpoints of that civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. So I believe the photographs in this book from Chicago actually span for over a decade, in which he's sent to Chicago from Amache upon release, attends the Illinois Institute of Design, publishes his first book, Someday Somewhere, moves back to Japan, but gets granted the Minolta Fellowship and is sent back to Chicago once again to photograph the city and its people. With all that context being laid out, let's go ahead and take a look at the photos in the book. So as we take a look at the pictures in the book, the cover image is actually part of one of my favorite sets. As someone who went to design school, as you'd expect, I think Ishimoto's layouts are just as memorable as important as his photos themselves. One of the most memorable for me are these two young girls side by side who include one Japanese girl he photographed in 1955 and a young Black girl he photographed in Chicago in 1953. They're presented together as if to ask you from Ishimoto what the difference between these two girls is, whether it's just their race or if you want to think about how they're treated respectively, what opportunities might be afforded to one and not the other. Asian Americans rarely feature in Ishimoto's Chicago work, but this is one of the few times in which they do. So we have a really nice eye line for our composition in which this flag intersects with the stair railing. And the flag is photographed covering this woman's face, and that makes me wonder if Ishimoto is perhaps signaling or asking us whether American identity is something which tries to supersede or cover up Asian or Asian American identity in his eyes. So this set of photos by Ishimoto is often shown at exhibits, and I can definitely understand why. They're part of a series of photos he took at beaches in Chicago, which, as we discussed previously, were really contentious places during the civil rights movement, and are also a place where there was a lot of class and race mixing. So these photos show people's legs and kind of anonymize them, and I think it's kind of a thing about humanization or dehumanization, and even given Ishimoto's keen eye for design. I still admire the ability to capture and bring out the human elements in his photos and get so many expressions. Although I think people back then just looked more expressive in photos. I don't know if that's just me. We've got these, looking at these boys here, I think we have a really interesting composition as their two respective eye lines kind of create kind of an interesting convergence here. And yet there's a woman walking in the background. So we kind of have a little bit of the rule of odds, although it's not quite adhering to that. And then this boy here is standing in front of a blown out sky. So it kind of creates like a 2/3, 1/3 split in this image. Just what I'm seeing here. I'm not a professional art critic, again, to remind you. And then on this page, we have some more experimental street work of his that I think shows Ishimoto isn't someone that you can easily define in very narrow terms. He was always experimenting. He was always taking photos of different subject matter. So these are really interesting. And I think they clearly show his design school education with this silhouette and shape and composition. And with this layout, we have another interesting juxtaposition, each using windows and areas around them as natural frames to contain his subjects. On the top, we have some perhaps more white, affluent city dwellers, and on the bottom, the people are perhaps more working class Black citizens of Chicago. And, you know, they're all in downtown, they're all coming together. So it kind of says something about, I guess, the dynamics of American cities. But compositionally, we just have an interesting diagonal going from these people's heights. And then it's a little more even over here. I'm not sure. With this layout, we're once again seeing some natural frames from these pay or die signs as these two gentlemen walk past each other, one white, one black, almost as mirror images of each other. As we come upon some of the work that he took during the civil rights era, we have these young boys campaigning for John F. Kennedy, or at least kind of running around with his signs. Kind of reminds me of how people today say to just kind of let kids be kids and not talk about politics. I can't imagine kids of today getting this worked up about the 2024 presidential election, but maybe that's just my own perception. Or it could say something about the pre-smartphone era. And I think I'm coming up on the last few photos. I don't want this video to be too long. With this one, we can see how he experiments with light and shadow and the American flag looming large over this gentleman and him being placed in this pool of light. This high contrast look can still be found a lot on Instagram today, signaling how... All right, so I think this is going to be one of the last photos I analyzed for today's video from the book, and we have a very meticulously laid out composition, very good balance of visual weight between these two objects. The left building barely making it into the frame, and then we have a nice eye line from left to right with these Pall Mall cigarettes. As Bresson would say, he's got a really good decisive moment here in which he's got this woman in a white dress entering the subway station. So technically and in many other ways, a masterpiece from this photographer. I think anyone who wants to pick up a copy of Someday Chicago can spend hours flipping through these images of people during the civil rights movement, children at play, interesting street scenes, and of course, photos of life inside of an internment camp. I'd like to close out the video by going over some of his major accomplishments. He published 3 books over the course of his life, including Someday Somewhere, Katsura Tradition and Creation in Japanese Architecture, and Chicago, Chicago. He won a number of awards, including the 3rd honorable mention in Life magazine's Young Photographers Contest, the Photographer's Prize by Japan Photo Critics Association, and he was honored as a man of cultural distinction by the Japanese government. He participated in multiple exhibitions of his work from 1957 to 1959, where he's said to have shaped the overall landscape of Japanese photography. And I mentioned him in today's topic of Asian American History Month, but he of course transcends that, and I think he's one of the most important photographers overall of the 20th century and beyond. So those are some of my thoughts on Yasuhiro Ishimoto. I'm really happy to be able to bring him to you today and hope that you can check out more of his work, the book that we've discussed, and that you can check out some of my future videos. Thank you so much. I've been Welkin Tang. Bye-bye.